Hello, Janine. Thank you for
Hi.
taking the time to chat with me today. So, I love the gifts of imperfection as well. What is it about that book that especially stood out to you?
I just think um, the ideas of like self-compassion and self-acceptance and just the fact that it made me feel not alone. That's really what happened. I felt like, I'd sort of been in this little tunnel and didn't feel like I could relate to other people or vice versa. And I read that and I saw how like all this research showed and all this data that she'd collected showed the things I was experiencing are really ubiquitous. A lot of people experience the same things. So, Brené's work, as you know, started where she researched vulnerability and shame, things like that. And at a certain point, organizations started to come to her to say, can you take this work and what you've done and apply it towards leadership? So she started to do research there and started to ask leaders of a whole swath of types of organizations like nonprofits and politics and education and large, Fortune 5 companies, what is necessary for companies to be standing in 5 years. And they all sort of said, we just need braver leaders. And then when she asked, what does that mean? Or what are the behaviors that brave leaders show? They're all like, I don't know, like you either have it or you don't. You're born with it or not. And like, right, she's a researcher. So doesn't work for her. So she flipped the question around and said, what are the behaviors do you notice in organizations that do not have brave leaders? And then the floodgates opened and all these, these common pitfalls of leadership came out, like inability to give feedback effectively or have hard conversations, or, when the walk is not being talked in terms of values, or, there's issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's so many things that came out probably. I think there's like 10 or 11 core behaviors. So her next step was then to think about, well, is there a way to teach the antidote to those behaviors that we don't want to have leaders exhibiting? And that's how this whole program got started. The section around rumbling with vulnerability is really basic emotional intelligence. It's understanding what are those things that sort of set you off and lead you to, in Brené's terms, armor up. It leads you to some kind of a reactive behavior that you use to protect yourself.
Got
And to
it.
be able to become aware of that and then choose to act from maybe a more grounded place versus a more reactive place. But it's a large piece of the curriculum. Even though there's 4 skills, it's a bigger chunk of the time that's spent in the program because it's so foundational. So she uses a lot of terminology like rumbling with vulnerability, entering the arena. And that's like things where, if you're challenged and you typically have a reaction to something, that's your sort of arena moment. So if you have a really hard time giving feedback, maybe that's your arena moment. And how can you get yourself to a grounded state to be able to have that conversation in a positive way? So that's the first one. Then there is living into your values, which is really aligning the talk and the walk so that, especially when you have to make really hard decisions, you are very grounded in what those values are and you have the strength and the skills to sort of do the hard thing versus the easy thing when the pedal hits the metal. And then there's braving trust, and the braving is, abbreviated. It basically the 7 particular elements that you can sort of tap into to build or rebuild trust with somebody. And it's really nice. I really like the braving trust piece of it, because it's like, it's difficult if you know that you have to rebuild trust with somebody. Like, well, how do I do that? Right. It seems very daunting. But there's these 7 elements that she's identified through her research that are pieces that, if you, for example, look for the B part, which is boundaries, maybe that's an area where I need to set better boundaries in order to build trust with somebody.
Mm.
And reliability is the R. So maybe I'm great at boundaries, but I'm not a very reliable person. So it sort of breaks it down into these 7 particular elements where you might be great at some of them and not so great at others. And you can be very explicit about, what do I need to do to sort of beef up the trust factor. And then finally, the last skill is learning to rise, which is actually, for those that have read Rising Strong, it's directly out of that book. It's a process to build resilience. And the idea is, if you are brave enough to, sort of do the hard things as a leader, you're going to fall on your face, your team's going to fall on their face. So how do you sort of build the resilience to rise back up? I believe it is beneficial to anybody. Even truthfully, I think you can replace the word leader with human. I really think it's just fundamental. Like, how do you exist in relation to other people and in relation to yourself? Like, the skills literally can be applied just to building your own self-awareness and self-regulation and communication skills and relational skills. So in terms of, if you are a leader, it really doesn't matter. I've seen emerging leaders get great great stuff in the program, and I've seen C-level people come in and get as much. So it's a question of just applying it. But I think it's like an all human program personally.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So would you say that organizations who invest and decide to go through the Dare to Lead, that they'll be better for it?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen that happen before. Again, it really depends on how much the organization is willing to invest, both, time, resources, and most importantly, maybe commitment after the actual teaching is done, because that's when you really have to sort of stick with it. But part of the program entails doing some befores and afters. That's the measurable piece of it. So before organizations or individuals take the program, they can do self-rating process, and for teams it sort of will look at the averages of the whole group. So you have your before snapshot, and then at any point where you want to maybe do another measurement later, you can do that and see what progress has been made.
Got it. So for anyone on the fence, they've heard of Brené, they maybe saw her TED Talk or her Netflix special. What would be your closing thoughts as it pertains to Dare to Lead to perhaps convince or sway them to consider taking a workshop?
Well, I'm a big fan of if you really feel the impulse and you're drawn to do it, that's the indicator that it's time to do something like this. Because it is, it's really fun. First of all, it is very fun and a very connected process. And also it does require vulnerability, and it requires, commitment to doing the work. And if that like energizes you, the thought of it energizes you, then it's time. You should do it, because you won't regret it. I can almost guarantee you that if you do the program, you're going to be happy at the end of it. And if you're drawn to it and feel energized by it, I'd say go for it.
Well, Janine, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for sharing your perspective about Dare to Lead, and hopefully others will be intrigued and have an interest in taking our next offering.
Yes. Thanks, Lakeya.
You're welcome.